afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Sheila Cromartie. I'm the current chair of RIMCO. RIMCO is a section of the North Carolina Library Association. For those of you who are not aware, we are the Roundtable for Ethnic Minority Concerns. This is our second in a series of programs that we are calling Culture Conversations with RIMCO, where we invite leading scholars and experts to speak with us on some of the issues that are related to us in the communities and the libraries that we face today. As you know, our webinar today is called Libraries and Social Justice with Professor Sheila Kennedy. And so we're going to have our vice chair of RIMCO give you a little bit of information about her before we go ahead and get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jewel Davis, Vice Chair of RIMCO, and our speaker today is Professor Sheila Kennedy. Professor Kennedy is Professor of Law and Policy in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. Professor Kennedy is a faculty fellow with both the Center for Religion and American Culture in the School of Liberal Arts and the Tobias Center of the Kelley School of Business, and an adjunct professor of political science. Professor Kennedy will be speaking for around 30 minutes, and then the webinar will be open for questions. There is a chat box available to your right for those questions, and if you have them during her presentation, you can put them in and we'll keep an eye on them, and we'll definitely call the ones to attention after she speaks for her to answer. So welcome, Professor Kennedy.
Thank you. And thank all of you for engaging in this conversation. Libraries and social justice is hardly a common theme. So when I was asked to address it, it took some mulling over, but then it started to make a lot of sense. There are, of course, some obvious ways in which libraries can serve the goals of social justice, ensuring that the collection includes sufficient information about the history of social justice struggles, the principles and philosophy, contemporary resources, and similar materials. Another method, of course, is through the library's traditional research and reference work. As more than one author has noted, topics around social justice are rife with inaccuracies, rumor, and outright propaganda. Providing credible, reliable materials that rebut inaccurate information is both essential in the age of the internet and supportive of social justice. I would say that the just concluded presidential election provides us with a pretty good example of how easily distortions, conspiracy theories, and outright propaganda gain traction. A more affirmative step that librarians can take to advance social justice is by designing and offering outreach services that meet the needs of underrepresented communities. In-home delivery services to seniors, for example, or non-English language services, even internet access services can all support social justice in communities with unique needs. But as important as all those very practical activities are, I want to make a somewhat different and perhaps more theoretical argument for the role of libraries and librarians in promoting social justice. First of all, I think it's fair to say that social justice is always and inevitably defined in the context of a particular society, a particular form of governance. Take, for example, some of the many definitions of that term. Promoting a just society by challenging injustice and valuing diversity. It exists when all people share a common humanity and therefore have a right to equitable treatment, support for human rights, and a fair allocation of community resources. In conditions of social justice, people are not to be discriminated against, nor their welfare and well-being constrained or prejudiced on the basis of gender, sexuality, religion, political affiliation, age, race, belief, disability, location, social class, socioeconomic circumstances, or any other characteristics of background or group membership. Okay, so those are the definitions of social justice: challenging injustice, equitable treatment, human rights, just acting against discrimination. All of those terms are subject to wide variations in meaning. All of them are constructed, which is to say, understood differently by different societies in different times. They are clearly understood differently by, for example, the Americans who voted for Donald Trump as opposed to the rest of us. American libraries, like American conceptions of social justice, are creatures of particular approach to the age-old question, how should people live together? As you all know, the earliest libraries were efforts to collect knowledge and serve scholarship. Many were housed in self-consciously ornate buildings, intended as evidence of the importance of a particular regime. Until modern times, libraries fell into 4 categories: imperial, patriarchal, monastic, or private, and none of them were about sharing knowledge. In the Middle Ages, in fact, monastic libraries often had their contents chained to the shelves. It wasn't until the Enlightenment in the 18th century that libraries were open to the public and materials loaned out. In the United States, the Boston Public Library, which opened in 1854, is usually considered the real first public library. That is, the first that was intentionally founded, not as a happy accident. Its statement of purpose describes the premises upon which most libraries are based today. First, there's a close linkage between knowledge and right thinking. The future of democracy is contingent on an educated citizenry. There's a strong correlation between the public library movement and public education, and the notion that every citizen has the right of free access to community-owned resources. Those are really quintessentially American ideas. And I would argue that libraries as we know them are important protectors of what I've sometimes called the American idea. You know, I wrote an journal some years ago about the importance of libraries to the exercise of democratic citizenship. And I dug it out for this webinar because I think it's pertinent to today's topic. I spent 6 years as executive director of the Indiana Civil Liberties Union. And of all the lessons I learned during that time, the most profound was this: the future of Western liberal democracy rests on the preservation of intellectual freedom. If that statement seems extravagant, consider both the ideological basis of liberal democracy and the nature of contemporary threats to that tradition. Our national history would have been impossible without the Enlightenment concept of the individual as a rights-bearing, autonomous being. That concept is absolutely integral to our legal system. It's the foundation upon which our forebears erected the Bill of Rights. The founders envisioned the good society as one composed of morally independent citizens whose rights in certain important circumstances superseded both the dictates of the state and the desires of the majority. The First Amendment rests upon a magnificent unifying premise: the integrity of the individual conscience. The First Amendment is really an integrated whole, protecting our individual rights to receive and disseminate information and ideas, to consider arguments and theories, to form our own beliefs and craft our own consciousness. It answers the fundamental social question, who shall decide, by vesting that authority in each individual, subject to and consistent with the equal rights of others. Our whole experiment with democratic governance rests on that foundation. As Alexander Meiklejohn famously observed, a nation that is afraid of an idea, any idea, is unfit for self-government. Implicit in the First Amendment is our legal system's concept of personal responsibility, the university's commitment to academic freedom, the moral authority of the clergy, the independence of the media, and the legitimacy of the political process. Now, those who oppose free expression rarely, if ever, see themselves in opposition to the whole Western liberal democratic tradition. Most of the people who want to ban the book or painting, who want to protect the flag or the Virgin Mary from desecration, are simply acting on their belief in the nature of the public good. Censors see unrestrained freedom as a threat to the social fabric, while we civil libertarians believe the greater danger consists in empowering the state to suppress dangerous or offensive ideas. Censors see no reason to protect expression that has low value. They see no point in protecting the marketplace for the exchange of shoddy goods. They have enormous difficulty understanding the difference between protection of the principle of free speech and an implicit endorsement of the offensive material at hand. And they have little or no appreciation for the argument that once one hands over to the state authority to decide which ideas have value, no ideas are safe. I spent my years at the ACLU battling the usual recurring attempts to control what others can read, hear, or download. I attended a public meeting in Valparaiso, Indiana, where an angry proponent of an ordinance to clean up local video stores called me a whore. I was accused of abetting racism for upholding the right of the KKK to demonstrate at the State House. I was criticized for failure to care about children when I objected to a proposal restricting minors' access to library materials. In each of these cases, and dozens of others, the people who wanted to suppress materials often had very good motives. They wanted to protect others from ideas they believed to be dangerous. To them, I appeared oblivious to the potential for evil. At best, they considered me a naive First Amendment purist, at worst, a moral degenerate. People try to remove materials from library shelves or the corner video store because they find the materials offensive. They try to prevent Klan marches because they disagree strongly with the hateful message of the Klan. Their arguments are against these particular ideas. They're not generally trying to strengthen the power of the state, nor intending to limit the exercise of personal moral autonomy. But civil libertarians see those outcomes as really the inevitable consequences of censorship. And so those are the issues that we address. In a very real sense, it's yet another case of culture warriors talking past each other. So you may be thinking, liberties are important, the First Amendment is important, but what is the connection to social justice? So here's my proposition. Civil liberties of every kind, equal protection, privacy, the right to due process of law, depend upon the sweeping protections of intellectual freedom enshrined in the First Amendment. Social justice, at least as it is conceived in our particular system, depends first of all on a definition of justice that requires fidelity to those other constitutional rights, especially the 14th Amendment rights to due process and equal protection of the laws. But the importance of libraries and intellectual freedom to social justice goes beyond that. Consider the elements of the definition of social justice that I shared at the beginning of this talk. Quote, promoting a just society by challenging injustice and valuing diversity, unquote. Libraries safeguard the history of battles against injustice and the works of essayists, academics, and philosophers who offer contending perspectives on what justice is and is not. By the very nature of their collections, by housing any and all ideas, libraries reproach injustices and celebrate intellectual diversity. Or one of the other definitions of social justice. Social justice exists when all people share a common humanity and therefore have a right to equitable treatment. Libraries treat all patrons as self-directed persons with inalienable rights to access materials of their own choosing. Librarians, in my view, model the attitude that all people share a common humanity, and they provide role models for the provision of equitable treatment. And then there was social justice includes support for human rights and a fair allocation of community resources. Well, there are numerous ways in which libraries support human rights, beginning with the human right to access information. But libraries are also a community resource, an intellectual infrastructure that's made available to all members of the community. And then there was the final definition of social justice. In conditions of social justice, people are not discriminated against, nor their welfare and well-being constrained or prejudiced on the basis of gender, sexuality, religion, political affiliation, age, race, belief, disability, location, social class, socioeconomic circumstance, or other characteristics of background or group membership. I'm not going to belabor that fairly lengthy definition further, but I've never encountered a situation in which a librarian refused to help a patron based on those criteria. Libraries and public schools are among the last street corners in our ever more fragmented and siloed society. Let me share a quote from a librarian that I think goes to the heart of the way in which libraries serve social justice. Broadly speaking, social justice issues reflect movements that push for greater voice and more representation for underrepresented or underpowered communities. Because libraries and librarians are tasked to serve all communities, we are inherently involved with and must be aware of issues of social justice. Ideals near to the heart of social justice advocates are egalitarianism, balance of power, social advocacy, public service, and diversity awareness. All of these issues are reflected in the work that librarians do to serve our communities. You know, I realize that the foregoing discussion has been very theoretical. So let me sort of conclude this with a far more concrete observation. Americans are facing very dark and divisive times. I don't want to get overly political here, but the election of Donald Trump is evidence that our citizens inhabit very different realities, and that those realities are all too often constructed of false or misleading information, conspiracy theories, and outright propaganda. Libraries, as sources of credible, reliable information, have never been more important. If there is one service of overriding importance that all of you can render, it is to help the public distinguish between trustworthy, credible information sources and the fake news purveyors that populate the internet. The next few years are likely to get ugly. Libraries and librarians are going to be more important than ever as community resources and havens, as educators and informational guides, as protectors of accurate history and of science, and especially as symbols of the importance of reason and intellectual inquiry, without which there can be no social justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we'll open up the chat box for questions now. And we already have one. How do you define human rights? It seems to me that there's a blurry line between human rights, things that should be given to all, and things which should be earned for oneself. This is from Lewis.
Okay. I think that's a great question. And of course, if you, I'm going to sort of throw it back, because it is the question that has animated political philosophy for a very long time. For example, I teach a course periodically that we call Individual Rights and the Common Good. And what we explore, starting with Aristotle and working our way through, is exactly that question. What are goods that we must consider to be public goods that are human rights, and what are what happens when those goods come into contact with or conflict with the rights and obligations of the individual? So, you know, I would love to say that I have a nice pat answer to that question, but I think it is a question that has bedeviled people for a very long time. And one good example of the arguments around that issue come from our approach to welfare, for example, where so many people attack the notion of poverty as a notion of individual moral failure, if you will, and others believe that larger social institutions are implicated. You know, the factory closed, somebody didn't get a decent education, whatever. So that line between what we can expect the individual to earn, if you will, and what we should be able to expect society to provide as part of the social fabric or the social contract is very contested. So I didn't answer your question. I'm sorry.
Lois says that she appreciates your insight.
Oh, thank you.
We're going to wait a couple of minutes, well, a few seconds to see. We do have another question. It is, how do you feel about the chasm between some Americans, about the way some Americans view Castro in the wake of his recent death? How do those feelings play into national politics when it comes to recognition of oppression in other nations, but not in our own? Social justice feels subjective at times.
Oh, I think that's right. And I think the different reactions, the tendency to perhaps whitewash some of the human rights violations that are done anywhere, out here as well as in other countries, it is attributable in large part to the fact that we are not doing a very good job in our schools right now, which probably makes libraries even more important. We are not teaching civic literacy. We are not teaching our own constitutional principles. We are not looking at the history of America, let alone other countries. Objective example, when we look at the conflict right now about the pipeline and the long-standing ill treatment of Native Americans in this country, there are so many people who simply have never been taught accurate American history, let alone accurate Cuban history.
We have another question. Where does hate speech fit into your defense of First Amendment rights?
Well, hate speech is, I mean, I've forgotten now which Supreme Court justice said that the First Amendment is protection for the ideal we hate. There is a huge difference between hate speech and hate crimes. And as despicable as hate speech is, and boy, we're seeing a whole lot more of it in the wake of this last election, I mean, certainly I would not argue that the government should censor it. I think that it provides for universities a teachable moments. Why is this kind of discourse wrong? Why is it harmful to the body politic? I mean, we need to use language from many Supreme Court decision. The antidote to bad speech is better speech. The antidote to bad ideas is better ideas. I think we're going to be testing that thesis over the next few years, and it's very discouraging.
There's two in the question box, the Q&A box that have come up that haven't been addressed yet. So one is asking, can you please restate the short definition of libraries and social justice? You started off by saying when all people share a common humanity, and then they didn't get the rest.
I tell you what I will be happy to do. I will send you, I've gotten rid of my notes is what I'm saying, but I will be happy to send you the text and you can distribute it to those who signed up for the webinar, if that helps.
Great, thank you so much. And then another in the question box is, do you have any examples of libraries that are engaged in social justice activities that we could look to as examples?
You know, I don't. I'm sorry.
One of the questions from an individual is, I work at a public university. Any tips on bringing these issues to the attention of administration when it is not a high priority to them? Seems like the budget is always the big issue.
Oh boy, yeah. You know, the university that I work for has made these issues a high priority, and I'm not quite sure how one would do that otherwise, but I would think that promoting on-campus discussions, you know, virtual, by virtue of get-togethers that are promoted to have these discussions. Certainly, if there are incidents of hate speech or other kinds of bigotry that emerge on a campus, that's a time to call a convocation of some sort to discuss it. And I would think that that would certainly raise the issue in the eyes of administration. I know that at our university, we have a vice chancellor who is charged with issues of diversity and cultural interaction. I mean, it is a very high priority here.
Another question is, do you have any ideas for public library programs that can bring social justice awareness to the public, or anything specific that we as librarians can do to assure social justice in our local public library?
Well, I think two things. One is obviously operating the library as every library I've ever seen does operate, which is not discriminating against any type of patron, that sort of thing. But the other is, most libraries that I work with and know of have public presentations on perhaps a monthly basis, whatever, and picking topics that are relevant to social justice and mounting those conversations around those topics is a way of gaining greater understanding among the public of those issues. The sad thing, of course, is that the people who really need to understand these issues are unlikely to come to presentations at libraries, but I don't know what we do about that.
Okay, and what are some suggestions for reluctant administration that believe librarians advocating for and teaching social justice is too political?
That's a consistent problem. And I think if you phrase it not as, if you denominate these kinds of efforts as efforts at civic, teaching civic literacy, it can sometimes be, it can avoid those accusations of politicization. What does United States history say about social justice? What does the Constitution require in various situations? I mean, those are topics that are not partisan political. I think it's sometimes very important to remind people who are worried about political stuff that there's two kinds of political material. There is political philosophy, which would include our legal system, our electoral system, those sorts of things, and partisan politics. And we don't want to be engaged necessarily in partisan politics, but we certainly want to help the schools and other organizations increase the level of civic engagement and civic literacy. And so politics in that sense, if it's properly defined, can sometimes diffuse concerns that are really concerns about being partisan rather than about being political.
The question is, I'm on the front desk, reference computer lab and teaching computer and tech classes in a rural, very red county. What practical advice do you have for connecting social justice principles to day-to-day practice for those wholly involved in public service and not involved in library decision-making?
Boy, each of you know your community better than somebody sitting here in Indianapolis, Indiana. But it's often the case that every community has conversations that can be, again, used as teachable moments. For example, if it's a very a rural community that is particularly religious, pointing out the importance of religious people not being singled out for mistreatment, and can then be used as a way of explaining the importance of that sort of liberty, that sort of freedom to people in other who practice other kinds of religion. So using local concerns to illuminate larger issues may be one way to do that.
Any suggestions or ideas for reaching children or teens about these issues in a public library?
Oh boy, my own sense is that teenagers and young people are much more inclusive and much more community oriented. At least, I would turn the country over to my students in a heartbeat, frankly, tomorrow. But I think one of the things that happens in the library that can be very dicey for the librarians is that young people who are exploring issues that perhaps they don't feel comfortable exploring at home or in their churches or other environments, librarians can make it very clear to kids that if you want to look up, I know, for example, in the gay community, a lot of young gay people who came from communities that were not particularly accepting used the library to to figure out who they were and where they fit in everything. So just the fact that the library is there to show them information in a non-critical, non-judgmental fashion is sometimes enough. So if a young person comes in and wants to know about, Muslims or whatever, the fact that the library can offer that information and that it's accurate information, and that the librarian is not going to say, well, why do you want to know? That, I think that can sometimes be far more effective than the librarian may actually recognize.
Is there ever a time when the library should not remain neutral?
Well, yeah. I mean, when there are attacks on the First Amendment, when there are efforts to censor what the library collection contains, certainly in those, or when there are local community manifestations of bigotry, I think that it is then imperative that libraries say that's not what we're about.
Okay, we have put out one last call for questions.
Okay.
Let's see if we get any more. Okay. So we don't see any more questions in the web chat. So Professor Kennedy, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us and your opinions on social justice and libraries. We will look for that information that you are going to send us, and we will send that out to the participants of the webinar.
As soon as our email goes back up.
Yes. Jewel, do you have anything else?
No, I just want to thank everyone for attending. If this is your second time coming to this conversation, thank you so much. We hope to give you more, and if you have ideas, let us know, and we'll see if we can find somebody who can talk about those issues for you.
Yes.
Thank you.